Welcome to Quick MCAT Lessons, where I try to explain MCAT topics in 10 minutes or less. Today we're going to continue our discussion on Psych 6b and continue talking about attention. So first let's talk about stimuli. There's distal stimuli and proximal stimuli. Distal stimuli is the actual objects and events in the environment. This is the things out there in the world that we are aware of and respond to. And so a basic example would be a tree across the street. Proximal stimuli is the stimuli that actually reaches our senses. This is like light waves hitting the retina or sound waves hitting the eardrum. An example would be the pattern of light from the tree that hits your retina. And so distal is the source and proximal is what your sensory organs actually detect. Now there's also something called orienting. This essentially means just paying attention to something. So you can either just pay attention to something without moving anything, and you just focus in on something, or you can pay attention to something by moving your eyes, your head, or anything. And so if you just don't move anything, you're just sitting there and you just focus on something else, this is called covert orienting. You're shifting your attention, but you're not moving anything. It's like mentally pointing your attention at something without physically turning to look. And so an example would be paying attention to a conversation behind you while still facing forward. And so on the contrary, if you move to focus your attention on something, then this is called overt orienting. So someone calls your name and you turn your head. And so this should be easy to remember because covert literally means not openly acknowledged or displayed. And if you've ever watched any sort of spy movie or anything, they'll be like, we're going on a covert operation. And so you're being sneaky, and so you're not moving. And then overt is just the opposite of that. Okay, now let's talk about attentional capture. So attentional capture refers to when a stimulus grabs your attention automatically. This is usually due to motion or sudden changes in the environment. So for example, your eyes involuntarily follow a bouncing ball that enters your field of vision. And so recall that we talked about exogenous cues, and this is what they do. They grab your attention automatically. But now let's talk about neglect syndrome. Neglect syndrome is a neurological condition that occurs when there is damage to certain areas of the brain, most commonly the right parietal lobe. This damage affects a person's ability to pay attention to one side of their environment, usually the left side. Now, even though their vision and sensation is intact, they fail to notice things on the affected side. So for example, someone with neglect syndrome might only shave the right side of their face. They might ignore food on the left side of their plate, might bump into objects on their left side without realizing it. And so this condition isn't caused by a problem with eyesight, but it's caused by a disruption in spatial attention, which is the brain's ability to process and respond to stimuli in a certain area of space. Neglect syndrome highlights the importance of attention in spatial awareness, and it especially impacts divided attention. This is because the brain is no longer allocating attention evenly across the visual field. Well, now let's move on to vigilance attention. This refers to the ability to sustain attention over a long period of time in order to detect a signal or target of interest. It's especially important in environments where the signal appears rarely or unpredictably. Signal detection is the actual process of identifying that specific relevant stimulus when it finally appears. It's like catching a subtle cue or change in your environment and responding appropriately. So let's take an example. Imagine you're driving down a highway and scanning the road for potholes. You're not reacting to anything yet, but your brain is on alert. It's ready to respond instantly when one appears. That's vigilance. When you finally see a pothole and swerve to avoid it, that is signal detection. So some key features of vigilance is that it helps prepare the brain and body to act quickly when the signal appears. It helps ensure fast, accurate responses in high-stakes or monotonous situations. It requires sustained attention and can fatigue over time, and it's strongly tied to active search, selective attention, and divided attention, all of which involve filtering out noise and distractions to detect meaningful signals. So some influencing factors for this is practice and arousal level. The more practice improves performance. A well-practiced task requires less attentional effort, so you're better at maintaining vigilance without burning out. Arousal level also affects performance, so moderate arousal means enhanced vigilance. Too little or too much arousal leads to reduced performance, and this is explained by the Yerkes-Dodson law. The Yerkes-Dodson law suggests that performance increases with physiological or mental arousal, but only up to a point. Beyond that optimal point, further increases in arousal lead to a decrease in performance. Now, there is also a neural basis for vigilance. So alerting attention, which is a component of vigilance, is modulated by norepinephrine from the locus coeruleus. Orienting attention, which helps shift focus from one stimulus to another, relies on acetylcholine from the basal forebrain. These networks are crucial for enabling both detection and rapid response. Finally, let's talk about executive attention. This type of attention involves high-level control processes like goal-directed behavior, conflict monitoring, and anticipating outcomes. This is strongly associated with the dopamine system, especially from the ventral tegmental area, or VTA. Now, you think of executive attention as the CEO of attention. It manages goals and resolves internal conflicts. And so before I finish today, I want to talk about the theories of selective attention. And so we talked about selective attention and the shadowing task, in which one wears headphones and hears two different sounds in each ear and is told to repeat everything in one ear and ignore the other. We can then ask questions about what they were told to ignore, and this helps us learn about selective attention as we can see what they filter out. There are three theories that try to explain this. First, we have Broadbent's early selection theory. This suggests that information is filtered very early in processing. All sensory input first enters the sensory buffer, which is like a temporary holding area. A selective filter then blocks out unattended information before it's processed for meaning. Only the attended message proceeds to higher level processing, like perception and awareness. A key idea is that unattended information is completely filtered out and doesn't reach your conscious awareness. But there's an issue with this, as it doesn't explain the cocktail party effect, which says that you'll hear your name through a bunch of conversations at a cocktail party. Now let's move on to Dutch and Dutch's late selection theory. This argues that all information is fully processed for meaning, so both attended and unattended stimuli. The selection or filtering happens late, just before entering conscious awareness. So every stimuli is analyzed, but only the most relevant or important one is consciously perceived and acted upon. An example would be, you may unconsciously process everything you hear, but only consciously notice the message you focus on. Issues with this is that you would spend a lot of time and energy processing everything first. This brings us to the final theory, Treisman's attenuation theory. Treisman modified Broadbent's model by proposing an attenuator instead of an absolute filter. This says that unattended information is not completely blocked, but rather turned down or weakened. Some unattended stimuli can still be processed if they are important or relevant, like hearing your own name. Attenuation allows for some unattended information to reach perceptual processing, but at a lower strength. And so an example of this would be the cocktail party effect, where you'd be focusing on your own conversation, but you still may notice your name being spoken or another. Now, a way you can remember these is you can think, when you were narrowing down your tasks, early on you start off broad and then narrow it down. And so broad or broad bent is narrow, and we're saying narrow because you're filtering early, and so you're making it narrow very early. And then Dutch is a douche because he makes you waste your energy processing everything before it's selected. So he's the late selection theory, where you process everything and then you select it or filter it later. And then finally, Treisman starts with a T, and he says you attenuate information before processing. So T and then attenuate. Now that's it for attention. Hopefully that all made sense. Next time we'll talk about drug dependence and psychoactive drugs.